So I feel very sympathetic towards fans of the MCU now who are feeling that somehow some sort of promise has been lost. That the excitement that we felt for that early MCU just hasn't carried through to the later MCU. And of course, that's pretty much exactly how we felt as comic book fans after 1970. And didn't quite understand why Marvel Comics wasn't quite as exciting after 1970 as it was before.
So then the next appearance of the microverse idea shows up more fully developed in the 67 annual. But before we talk about the Psycho Man, we have to talk about the Hate Monger. And the Hate Monger was a character that was a really direct comparison between the reaction to the civil rights movement in the United States and Kirby drawing a very direct parallel to the Nazi movement in Germany.
Wally Wood joins the Marvel bullpen for a short time, and he takes over Daredevil as well as various inking projects. The origin of the character goes back to the 1940s, and in Silver Streak Comics, which is a character is very much like a Flash knockoff character as the lead character, they introduced in the 6th issue a new character called Daredevil with a similar design motif. But he has one of the weirdest origin stories of all time. Now, this is a bit of a reunion for Wood and Kirby because they had worked together before, and most recently on Jack Kirby's Challengers the Unknown series for DC Comics. You can see by looking at Challengers the Unknown that it was a very ambitious project, and Kirby put a lot of work into it.
The Hate Monger's gimmick is his ray of hatred.
Well, hey, hello, and how the heck are ya? And welcome to the program where I crack into my old 1960s comic book collection and reminisce about my incredible positive memories of the media of that time in the mid-60s. And this all comes from my very peculiar perspective of having grown up on the west coast of the mysterious land of Canada. So I do have a bit of a second-hand view of a lot of things, and of course, as I have mentioned, I have dropped out of television viewership some 20-odd years ago, and so it's been a bit of a surprise to me to slowly use YouTube to reacquaint myself with current affairs in the world at large, and, well, an eye-opening, surprising experience it has been.
Country. I love Canada. I've always loved Canada because of its natural beauty. Why should we let it become Cuba? Like, why don't we liberate it? We're spending all this money to liberate Ukraine from the Russians. Why are we not sending an armed force north to liberate Canada from Trudeau? And I mean it.
And in this new era of, well, what do we call it? The post-seriousness era? Well, we're gonna be a little bit more fast and loose with our comparisons. And this is what we're gonna do. We're going to look at a bunch of things, old and new, and compare them to a bunch of other things. So we had been talking about the developments that were going on in 1964 in the Tales of Asgard feature in the back of Thor comics. So we'll wrap that up with a look at the last couple of those before we actually catch up to 1965, the big cultural turning point that we're really trying to get to here, because of course we want to make a comparison between the big cultural turning point that we see happening in 1965 and of course what's going on today. And of course I'm sitting here in Canada, so I get to play Radio Free Europe and give you an outside view of my hilarious take on the entire situation, and hopefully make you feel a little bit more hopeful, because things like this have happened before and we have survived them, and in fact they were a lot worse in the past, so we can draw some comparisons there as well.
Folytatva a délutáni rendezvú műsorát, következőnek a Drifters együttes és On Broadway.
They say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. On Broadway.
So we're continuing on with a retrospective look at the year 1964, where Jack Kirby's Tales of Asgard series was the place where he started to experiment most radically, and the culmination of that experiment is that Tales of Asgard series really does take over the Thor series as a whole and very much changes the concept to the point where it was necessary to do a retcon in the original run of Kirby's Thor comics, because of this very radical change in the structure of the comic book series as being a strict superhero, Superman analog, to it being a tale that really combines real true elements of mythology with real contemporary ideas of science fiction, which is what made it the most vibrant and exciting comic book of its time. And still today, it resonates in all creators' minds. So back to it, and I'll just carry on where I left off. And we continue with another two-part story of Journey into Mystery number 111, December of 1964. And here we have the situation where, in a time-frozen lair of his enemies, Thor is defending his fatally injured nurse and true love, Jane Foster. And so anyway, of course, because this is the lair of his villains, and despite his brutish appearance, Mr. Hyde is indeed a scientist, and he is, of course, rigged their hideout with many, many traps to try to subdue the mighty Thor. And here in the outside world, people are noticing, what the heck is going on? I throw a rock and it just stops in midair. This is some sort of a time field. And here we have, again, back in Asgard, we see Balder in his minstrel incarnation stops and sings a old love song, reminds Odin himself of his own courtship of Thor's mother. And this, again, is the one and only appearance of Thor's mother, the goddess Frigg or Frigga. I don't even remember which one they used. This is again the early presentation of Balder. We are seeing him as a minstrel poet, and he is moving Odin to have sympathy on Thor while he battles for the life of his fatally injured true love, the mortal Jane Foster. Odin then gives Balder the license to go out and find the secret magical potion of reviving people on the very edge of life and death. And here we have Thor back in the lair fighting more terrible traps and weapons that he must thwart as he fights his now magically extra powered arch villains, while Balder is questing back in Asgard and having to face various troubling questy type challenges, one of which is this big giant wind monster, but that isn't the half of it. We have Fantastic Four, one of the oddest villains of all, Gideon, which is just strange. So here he in his challenging quest situation, he must go through the noxious poisonous mushroom forest, the crystal dagger plane of impalement, and the terrible valley of avalanches, and finally he gets to the very ancient healer, who he then secures a magical potion, which he then tosses down with a jaunty note back to Midgard on connected to his magical sword, which I mean, where were we? Magical sword. Then of course he gives the magical potion to Jane Foster, who is then of course revived instantly, and the magic sword lifts itself off of the ground and back in through the dimensional doorway that is the Rainbow Bridge, and Balder catches the blade. So we see that Balder, over this couple of issues, has evolved into one of the most central characters and is important to every story. And this is a peculiarity of Kirby's interpretation of the Norse mythology, where he keeps the dying god alive, and this is a idea that is kind of important to his whole approach of saying that this isn't really Norse mythology. And so this Odin, though he is all omnipotent, he's not the murderous king of the gallows that the actual Odin is. And so by making his own interesting variation of the mythology, he is able to tell a story that is much more contemporary to America in 1964, and we're just on the end of 1964 here, where we are introduced to another one-time character who's a real favorite of mine, and is important to the Germanic arm of this mythology, and this is Sigurd. But this version of Sigurd, who is really a lot more like King Arthur and much more connected to the King Arthur mythology, what Kirby's doing here is he's connecting the character to one of the Greek Titans. And of course, one of the characteristics of certain Greek Titans that we see over and over again in Greek mythology is the idea that because they are champions of the earth, every time they are struck down to touch the earth, they are refreshed and revived. So even though Thor's mighty hammer easily smashes the mace of Sigurd, he is instantly recharged and leaps back into action, and Thor begins to realize, hey, this guy just seems to keep going like the frickin' Energizer Bunny. And then it strikes him a great plan, where he then plants his magical hammer in the very weightlifter type belt of the mighty Sigurd, and he tosses him far, far into the outer atmosphere, far away from the earth, where he no longer will have any powers. And this is like one of the greatest single appearances. Absolutely a favorite costume of mine. But we never see this character ever again. And it is, like I say, a very a character that's an amalgamation of a bunch of mythological characters. That was what we'll see. The way Kirby does use the mythology is in a very interchangeable way, which makes him a great touching off point for some really interesting ideas about mythology. So the most significant change that happens in Marvel Comics in 1965 is that Wally Wood joins the Marvel bullpen for a short time, and he takes over Daredevil, as well as various inking projects. Now, it is worth taking a moment to talk about the backstory of the development of the Daredevil character, because it is really quite interesting. And of course, Wally Wood was the third famous cartoonist to work on Marvel's Daredevil series. The origin was done by Bill Everett, of course, and the second and third issues were done by EC alumnus Joe Orlando, and that introduced the characters of the Owl and the Purple Man, both of which did get used again and again. Not super popular characters, but certainly characters that were used for quite some time. But as it turns out, the origin of the character goes back to the 1940s. And in Silver Streak Comics, which is a character is very much like a Flash knockoff character as the lead character, they introduced in the 6th issue a new character called Daredevil with a similar design motif. But he has one of the weirdest origin stories of all time. So it turns out, when our hero was a young boy, his family is attacked by a roving gang of criminals, and his father is an inventor, but it doesn't seem to reflect in any way on the overall story. But the important thing is he is tortured himself, and he is branded with the sign of a boomerang, and this traumatizes him so badly that he loses the power of speech. And then, as our hero appears over the city, we see he has some really striking design elements. We notice right away he's got the little holster on his one leg, and that his boomerang is hinged so he can fold it up and put it away when he's not using it. And when he does use it, he uses it to great effect, and he can throw it at great distances and even down planes. And of course, if we look at this very unique first appearance, his color scheme is a really striking yellow and black that you color the highlights blue. And we see this scene here where he breaks into a bar room full of thugs and beats them all up and raises hell. And it reads very much like Frank Miller's take on Daredevil. And this very first appearance is the only appearance by this artist. And it's taken over immediately by another famous artist. And the color scheme and the overall design changes very radically. So when Stan Lee contacted Charles Biro and asked if he could use this character, he used the very first appearance of the character, because the very first appearance was quite unique. And these really fine nuances of detail don't actually appear in the later series, which became quite popular. He became the most popular character for the publisher, and the comic book eventually became Crime Does Not Pay. And of course, that ran into some trouble. Immediately afterward, the series is taken over by Jack Cole, famous for Plastic Man, and he gets into a battle with an extremely bizarre character called the Claw, who is an Asian super scientist, I guess, and he makes himself grow to giant size and has energy powers, and he's just a real living nightmare, this guy. And so I hear you asking yourself, how does this little action hero stop a big giant guy? Well, as it turns out, when he's tossed into the stratosphere, he bends his body into the shape of a boomerang, thereby swinging back, not unlike a boomerang himself, and he socks the grotesquely stereotypical creature right in the eye, thereby vanquishing him. Now, what a bizarre character, but the Daredevil character was one of the greats of the 40s superhero characters, and he was used to great effect by the Marvel bullpen, and Wally Wood would do 2 issues with the black and yellow costume before he would then create the truly iconic costume that we all know and love today. Now, this is a bit of a reunion for Wood and Kirby because they had worked together before, and most recently on Jack Kirby's Challengers of the Unknown series for DC Comics. You can see by looking at Challengers of the Unknown that it was a very ambitious project, and Kirby put a lot of work into it. In fact, if we look at it, it is some of his most complex and detailed work he ever did. And so when Wally Wood inked some of these stories, they of course had the finest finish that was available, one of the great inkers of the comic book scene. And so the look of Challengers of the Unknown was very, very different than that of the early Marvel comics. Whereas Challengers of the Unknown, Kirby was putting a huge amount of time and effort into these illustrations. But when the Challengers project broke down and Kirby left DC, he went to Timely Comics, and they restarted as Marvel Comics, and Kirby produced a whole different style of artwork. He produced lots of material very quickly, focused on very short stories, and just did lots of them. So when Wally Wood and Jack Kirby reunite in 1965, Kirby's been working at a very quick pace for quite a while, and then there's an emphasis now on putting more time and more thought into the comics that he's doing, and then the comics become much more complex at this stage and definitely become a much more textured images, and of course this is where the printing of Marvel Comics really is highlighted. Now, where Kirby and Wood were old veterans that had worked together, Ditko, on the other hand, was a younger cartoonist, and this is probably the first time he met Wally Wood. And so I would say that Ditko's innovation with his super complex Doctor Strange story was his contribution to comics, and it's something I don't think he gets nearly the credit for making stories far more complex than they had been up to this point. Now, Wood and Ditko would go on to work together when Wally Wood used Marvel to get involved with the Tower Comics Thunder Agents series. Ditko did some of the most memorable stories in the Thunder Agents series. The Death of Menthor stands out in my mind particularly. But then later at DC, Wood and Ditko would work together on a fantasy series, The Stalker. An interesting side note, the Stalker was the inspiration of the character that James Robinson used to restart the Justice Society series. So a series of one-shots that were bracketed by the 2 giant-size stories. Interesting look because it was Michael Lark, who had kind of made a name for himself on the Gotham Crime series. And so what we're pointing out here is that we recognize the character who becomes our main villain, and our main villain who is brought to life through a magical ritual. We have the villain introduced, and he is indeed the Stalker. And we even have a tumultuous entrance, and then we do eventually get to the origin of the Stalker, and he is very clearly the very character that Ditko and Wood had created. And if you have a look at the look of the character, they've in fact changed his armor to be basically the prototype of what. So we see the design is very much like that was used in the Justice League movie for the Steppenwolf character. And then, of course, the Justice League of America movie used that template again to reimagine the Steppenwolf character, who then got reimagined again. And at least they got it at the end there, I think. Now, as a neurodivergent person who is gifted with the condition that is referred to as bipolar affective disorder, I have always had a certain awareness of mental health issues. Even before I was myself aware that I was a lucky winner of the unique insight that comes from being a manic depressive, I felt something was not quite right with the world, and this led me to a curiosity. And ultimately, what I find is that it was studying art history that was the thing that helped me the most, and it's identifying with certain people who took on a very expressionistic view of the world, and that was very helpful in understanding the intensity of human emotion and insight that could be actually captured on canvas. And this was something that created possibilities in my mind, even without actually knowing what the medical diagnosis you would necessarily connect to these things. But it did give me a broader spectrum of possibilities, even though I didn't really know what was going on anyway. And this is all of neurodivergent wisdom. So, and in that point, there are a couple of really good documentaries about the subject of being bipolar disorder as well. And so one really intense, brilliant film, really worth watching, is the film Being Jesus. And this is really intense, and it's very worth watching. And it really talks about how the incredible manic state does affect a person's mind. Another film that is not as intense necessarily, with a lot more information, is a BBC production by Stephen Fry, and that is about his experience of being a manic depressive as well. And so these are two really, really insightful things, really worth watching, because it's one of those things that people have a way better chance if they actually know they're experiencing this, and that it is a chemical disorder, and it's a chemical disorder that we've gotten very good at managing, but you also have to have a certain awareness. It's not like the pill just changes you completely. It just smooths out the extreme waves, ultimately. What does an old guy like me know? Oh wait, I got old, didn't I? So I feel very sympathetic towards fans of the MCU now who are feeling that somehow some sort of promise has been lost. That the excitement that we felt for that early MCU just hasn't carried through to the later MCU. And of course, that's pretty much exactly how we felt as comic book fans after 1970, and didn't quite understand why Marvel Comics wasn't quite as exciting after 1970 as it was before. And a lot of that had to do with us being misinformed about who in fact was writing the stories. And we had thought that Stan Lee was in fact the limitless fountain of ideas that drove Marvel Comics. And of course, in the 80s, we also had the Comics Journal, and a lot of interviews with people started to come out and are beginning to understand what the real dynamics of Marvel Comics was. And of course, that changes our view now. Now, on a slightly more somber note, not all of our mementos, of course, are happy ones, and there are some things that we do have mementos of that were very sad, and there are definitely very few people who really symbolize a changing of an era than the life and death of John Lennon. But the impact of the Beatles on not only American culture, but European culture, the world culture, really cannot be overstated. We never will see such a bottleneck of influence in one place. Once they broke onto the American market, their influence was quite unstoppable. And now, in the back of my mind, I'd always thought that there was kind of a parallel between how the arrival of the Beatles on the pop music scene was a transformation, very much the way Marvel Comics did completely change their style about midway through the 60s and developed a much more sophisticated approach to storytelling. Now, as I started to look into this, I found there was many more parallels to this observation than I'd first realized. So one of the things I found out about looking into the timing of the arrival of the Beatles was a story where in their second trip to America, about 6 months into the year 1964, the Beatles met with Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan introduced them to some ideas about the civil rights movement that the Beatles took to heart, and they discussed other cultural issues. But it is pointed out that from this point on, both the Beatles and Bob Dylan were influenced by each other, and by drawing their work together, there was an unusual situation where a very young teeny bopper audience and a college age intellectual audience started to converge, and this created one of the most interesting and vital periods in the history of popular culture. Now, a similar anecdote happens with Marvel Comics, where Wally Wood joins the bullpen in the very end of 1964. So just within a few months of the same event, Wally Wood rejoined Jack Kirby because they had worked together on other projects in the past, Challengers of the Unknown for DC Comics most notably. But the story goes that Wally Wood challenged Jack Kirby to put his characters in more danger. His characters were just too powerful, Wood thought, and that he should find a way to put his characters in more danger. And this was something that Kirby obviously took to heart, and we could see the change in his storytelling from this very month, the month after Wally Wood has come to work at Marvel. More recently, however, when I was doing this various research and looking back on the incredible years of my childhood, I noticed that there was a new film coming out of the MCU, and I became curious. And of course, the Ant-Man movie chose a name that made a very clear connection between, well, the Beatles, the excitement over the Beatles' arrival in America, and the newest Ant-Man movie from the MCU. And, well, maybe that wasn't the best comparison one could possibly make, but it did get me curious, and so I did what people do nowadays, is I went and I watched a bunch of YouTube movie reviews of the film and found them very amusing and uniformly critical of the film. But piecing together the plot, it all started to sound kind of familiar, and so I had to stop and look back at a couple of comic book stories that I hadn't really thought about for a little while. So, of course, that plot sounded very familiar to me, and so I had to go and look up what was one of my favorite series resolutions of all time, and that was Brian Michael Bendis's closer on his very popular run of The Avengers.
So, looking back at Brian Michael Bendis's four-part conclusion to his run on The Avengers, we begin with Henry Pym starting the search for his vanished wife thought dead in the Skrull invasion story, if I recall. And here we begin with a plucky refugee slash fugitive in an alien landscape. And the rebel forces motif seems to be being explored here. And then we soon have the Avengers going to the microverse to, in fact, meet up with said plucky refugee, who indeed turns out to be the missing Janet Pym. And then here's the part that I didn't remember, was the arrival of the villain of this society. Now, thinking about it for a minute, I hadn't remembered this character, but when I thought about it, it reminded me of a character from an earlier series, the Micronaut series, Michael Golden and Bill Mantlo, and the villain who was shamelessly swiped from Jack Kirby's New God series also had a centaur form. And not only that, he was quite fond of throwing about energy blasts from his hands. Wait a second, who does that remind us of? But the completely wrong character. There is actually more. We move on to a big, huge spaceship battle with giants and superheroes flying about. That sounds a little familiar too. But when things are getting really tense, there's a last-minute save by the Incredible Wonder Man, which in this story is really clever because he had to figure out how to shrink his ionic energy down to the microverse. But in the movie, what do we get? The same color, and let's not get started on the dreaded MODOK just now. So anyway, we have this big final battle, and we switch the scene to the vigil going on at Central Park, where Janet Pym originally disappeared, and the Avengers triumphantly return. And Janet Pym is very happy to be back on terra firma, and no sooner are we happy that we are terrified again because the giant-sized centaur villain has followed them. And this sets up a great series of final splash pages by a bunch of the artists who worked in the series, and it was a great finale. And so this is, as an end to this Bendis run of Avengers, this was a really nicely crafted story. Here we even end out with a welcome home party that is very reminiscent of the weddings that went on in the Avengers, including John Buscema and Roy Thomas's run. And we move on to things to come.
Wait a minute. The microverse? That doesn't make sense at all.
So the microverse in Jack Kirby's work shows up as early as his Challenge of the Unknown series in '58, where he plays around with this idea of people being shrunk within a year of the Incredible Shrinking Man movie having come out, which shows how Kirby was very involved with the sci-fi media at the time. So his relationship falls apart with DC, goes over, works for Archie Comics, does a couple of superhero series for them, one of them being The Shield, and this leads to, well, this incredible scene, which is, well, memorable just for itself. But anyway, as far as Marvel Comics are, the first appearance of Microverse is Fantastic Four number 16, but we have to take a step back to Fantastic Four number 10, where he returns from being lost in deep space from an earlier appearance where he was saved by some highly intelligent aliens with mental powers that he learns from, and then uses these powers to body swap with Reed Richards. This, of course, leads to the chaotic scene where the Fantastic Four turn against their own leader unknowingly. And then in some of these great half splash pages, we see the next development of Doom's scientific research goes into miniaturization rays. And although he's found out, he is then the victim of his own miniaturization ray and shrinks out of sight. And we think, well, that's got to be the end of Doctor Doom, right? No, of course not. He then, of course, returns to number 16, and when things start shrinking, the Fantastic Four call on the Ant-Man to help them search out the various Mr. Doom in the microverse, where there's this kind of feudal kingdom that he has taken over the way Doctor Doom was wont to do. So then the next appearance of the microverse idea shows up more fully developed in the 67 annual. But before we talk about the Psycho Man, we have to talk about the Hate Monger. And the Hate Monger was a character that was a really direct comparison between the reaction to the civil rights movement in the United States and Kirby drawing a very direct parallel to the Nazi movement in Germany. And so the Hate Monger's gimmick is his ray of hatred, which he turns on the Fantastic Four, turning them on themselves, and then through various difficulties they confront him, and he is a victim of his own ray, and it turns out, well, whatever it means, he's just to make it really clear what we're talking about, the civil rights movement. Now back to the 67 annual, we open with Storm fainting, showing us that she's in fact pregnant, which is startling enough, but then a brand new villain, Psycho Man, is introduced, and he has an entire keyboard of emotional manipulation, which he uses fear to drive this potential henchman into a suicidal panic where he jumps out the window. Then, the other potential henchman, he decides to use the power of doubt to make them into shivering sycophants that will obey his every order. Gee, that seems a little contemporary almost. Oh, wait, anyway, so big climax, or confront the Psycho Man in his lair, and he reveals that he is in fact operating in this world through a telepresence, his costume being actually only a mechanical suit. But he comes from the microverse, and he manipulates emotions from a microscopic world that we can't see. Gee, it's almost like an idea that I'd heard of before somewhere, but anyway, we could possibly have worked out a really interesting story about a invisible alien manipulating the emotions of a young girl, but we didn't get that at all. We got something entirely different that wasn't really relevant to anything so far as I can tell.
So we're picking up our story at the tail end of 1964. We are building up to the big turning point in the Marvel Age of Comics, and this is where Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko decide to get a little more serious about their storytelling. And of course, another extremely big thing that happens at the very end of 64 is the arrival of Wally Wood at the bullpen. And that, of course, would change many things in the years to come. Now, I've always been a Wood fan. I, in fact, did buy the very last issue of the Thunder Agents off of the newsstand. I bought a last issue of a couple of things. Just as I got to buying new comics, a bunch of things actually ended. But again, through the magic of YouTube, I've learned a bunch of things that I never knew before. There are two fabulous documentaries on Wally Wood on YouTube. One by Comics Tropes, which is very detailed and gets into the very last phase of Wally Wood's relationship with Mad Magazine. Another very good documentary is by the FizFop 1 channel, which we have mentioned before, and this actually gets into a very interesting personal note where he actually has a bit of an identification with some of the medical issues that were dealt with, which of course led to a rather tragic end to our beloved cartoonist hero. So that's important, and that leads us, while we're on the topic of very good documentaries about these great heroes, I will also point out a very impressive documentary on Jack Kirby and his magnum opus of the New Gods. And this is a really incredibly well put together piece of work, very well researched, and has some interviews with Steve Rude, who has did spend time talking to Kirby and had a lot of personal knowledge of Kirby. And this is where we get to one of the more important aspects of Kirby, and that's his wartime experience and how Kirby used his creativity to translate that traumatic experience into something very creative. And I think that is one of the things that we really do have to be really in admiration for of Kirby, because so many of the people traumatized by their experiences in the Second World War became very serious alcoholics and just beat their children. So this is another thing that also, as a commentator who self-identifies as crazy, we have to take a moment to look at the mental health implications of all of the things that we're interacting with. And, well, of course, that's sooner or later going to lead us to current events, isn't it? But I have nothing to say on that topic at this exact time. And as I did point out, part of this story, when we get to the thrilling climax in this issue, we have an interesting subplot that involves Mr. Terrific. And it is this subplot that involves Mr. Terrific that changes our entire idea of the character. And this is, of course, subtly makes an incredibly boring and uninteresting character into a very interesting and relevant character that, although he himself is never really used ever again, it does set up for Jeff Johns to reintroduce the black version of the character, but he's only really a viable character because of this one story. Another really interesting artist here. This is William Rosado. We knew him from that very exciting series he did with the second generation Green Arrow, the Connor Hawk series that Chuck Dixon wrote, and was a very short run, but a really fabulous run, and I'm sure he ended up working in the movie industry doing storyboards because his work was just very, very cinematic indeed. Anyway, good little side point there.